just a couple of biographical details. I've got a career of about 35 years now, which is frightening. About 20 years of that was devoted to attitude research, and I suppose the last 15 years I've spent looking at individual difference variables, intelligence, personality, its relation to business behavior, and very much recent work on the structure of personality. So I've got maybe a slightly different take on attitudes, and I suppose virtually anybody that researches attitudes actually has. I'm going to talk about what I think are three common problems with attitude research. Of course, really what is a problem or not a problem depends upon your take on attitude research. But I'm going to choose three problems to talk about. It's not an exhaustive list by any stretch of imagination. But I think attitude research generally provides weak control for other variables. It's mostly based on self-report. And the majority of studies are cross-sectional, and even longitudinal studies are frequently poorly statistically analysed. If we're going to talk about a problem, a problem with what? Well, I've just listed here some common types of attitude research, and I think the observations I'm going to make apply to many of these, may not apply to many other types of attitude research. But certainly in psychology, an awful lot of effort has been devoted to looking at attitude-behavior relationships. This is hugely diverse, but a lot of it is to do with health behavior. There's been a lot of studies of subjective well-being, which is not really a very well-defined concept. It tends to include things like life satisfaction, happiness, affect, quality of life, and so on. In a work context, principal concerns, at least historically, have been job satisfaction, job performance, turnover, and other prominent areas of research have been attitude change and intergroup behaviour. As I say, this is by no means a complete list. I don't know how well you can see this, but the first problem that I want to talk about really is potential other variables. And I suppose the starting point is to try and establish their relative importance. And I'm attempting to do that by looking at meta-analyses of relationships between attitudes and subsequent behaviour. Probably the most, not sure how this works, probably the most successful theory in psychology of attitude and behaviour is the theory of planned behaviour. And it's able, on average, to predict about 20% of variance in observed behaviour and about 31% in self-reported behaviour. So that rather suggests that an absolute top limit, you know, that attitudes, at least within this model, can explain is 20% of variance. And of course, a lot of that variance may actually be attributable to non-attitude variables. This is the job characteristics model, which actually does rather better in some respects. Originally, the model was intended to predict work performance and job satisfaction. It turns out that it does a pretty poor job of predicting job performance, but actually a rather good job of predicting job satisfaction with 55% of the variance. Now, for comparison purposes, I just just thought I'd look at a range of other variables and their ability to predict behavior. I focused on personality and intelligence. Of course, I could have looked at a range of other variables. If one takes the NEO, which is one of the currently accepted broad measures of personality, in terms of negative affect, it explains about 42% of the variance, life satisfaction 24%, quality of life 63%. If we move on to academic and job performance, and I'm just taking one facet of personality here, prediction is 30% for academic performance and between 26% and 41% for job, 30% for job performance. If you take intelligence, and this has been very widely explored, predictive validities tend to range from about 0.26 to 0.41, and that really depends on the level of the complexity of the job. For more complex jobs, it's claimed that intelligence predicts more. And in fact, Linda Gottfredson sometimes claims that the prediction is about 64%. But I've never seen any figures that justify that. Finally, this is a study of the effect of intelligence and neuroticism on chronic obesity and what's called metabolic syndrome, which might be considered to be objective subjective well-being. This study predicted 57% of the variance in chronic disease and 61% in metabolic syndrome. That's obviously astonishing. It may have something to do with the fact that it's kind of aggregated data, but nevertheless, it's pretty impressive. And I think overall, my conclusions would be that, if anything, personality and intelligence is rather more important for predicting the kinds of things that attitudes are supposed to predict. So we should at least take account of them in attitude research. The question then is how you actually do that at a practical level. Well, one possible way of doing it is to specifically measure them. This is actually difficult. For a valid measure of intelligence, you probably need a minimum testing time of about 40 minutes. So I think that that's really only practical in large-scale studies. If you're looking at personality, there are short scales which exist, but the subsequent research that I'm going to talk about really suggests that to get valid ratings, you need large numbers of multiple ratings. So I suppose that my conclusion would be that this is the preferred strategy, but it's probably only really practical in very large scale surveys. I'm not sure whether I'm really going to be able to go through all of this in great detail, but an alternative perspective on the other variables problem is behavior genetic research. And basically, behavior genetic research gives you clues about the possible mechanisms and possible other variables because it can partial out variants attributable to heritability, to shared environment, to cultural transmission, and so on, depending upon what kind of design you actually use. I suppose, without going through this in huge detail. All of these are, sorry. All of these are what are called broad heritability estimates. That is the total amount of variance which is explicable in terms of genetic effects. And there are different types of genetic effects, which are principally additive and dominant, but other types as well. Now, what I think surprises most people is many variables are very strongly genetically determined. Intelligence, there are estimates between 75 and 80% heritability, but that is in adult populations. It's rather different when you're talking about children. Personality, you tend to get figures somewhere between 40, 50%, maybe top whack, 60%. What I think would surprise most people, if they're not surprised by that, is you can derive estimates of heritability of liberalism and conservatism, which is what Alison was talking about earlier. And certainly on the basis of this particular study, something like 93% of variance of male liberalism and conservatism is due to genetic factors. And that was why I was so interested in the change in British attitudes over time. I mean, heritability is not incompatible with change, actually, but there does seem to be some kind of strange contradiction there. If we just take a range of attitudes, there are heritabilities for something like 30 different attitudes, but death penalty about 50%, censorship about 80% in males, 35% in females. Just to prove that not everything is genetically determined, heritability of voting is pretty small. And then finally, I just took a behavior. I could have taken hundreds. Smoking is about 58% heritable in males and 54% in females. The probable reason for that, at least suggested by recent research, is that impulsivity, which is a generic term for a range of dispositions, seems to underlie a whole range of addictive behaviors, not just smoking, but heroin addiction, and so on. So, to conclude from that, typically heritability of attitudes and related behaviors is substantial, but not always, and not for all attitudes. I think the advantage of genetic designs is that they can classify variants, and that gives you clues about probable underlying mechanisms, probable underlying variables. And depending upon the design, you can work out what's additive genetic variance, what is attributable to genetic dominance, what's attributable to unique environment, shared environment, and cultural inheritance. So, I mean, the area in which, if you like, true attitudes operate is in the environmental and cultural inheritance variance. The next issue that I want to talk about is the problems with self-report. The way I'm going to do this is by looking at self-report in personality research. Now, this may not be totally useful, but I do think that it can suggest strategies that people might look at to investigate, if you like, the validity of self-report in attitudes. I also think that it's quite informative in the sense that I've already shown you that quite a lot of attitudes actually behave like personality variables anyway. This was a meta-analysis, and it corrected for lack of reliability of measurements. And it showed the concordance of different raters. If they were family, the correlation was about 0.44, friends 0.48, cohabitors 0.31, work colleagues 0.29, incidental acquaintances 0.31, and strangers 0.36. So there isn't a huge amount of, if you like, correlation between different raters. And I suspect if you could do it, the same would be true for self-ratings. So there is a problem, if you like, of reliability of measurement in self-report. There are some interesting features of that, but I don't really think I've got time to deal with it. The next set of data is to do with correspondence between other ratings and self-ratings. These are rather strange figures. Those are for single family members, single friends, cohabitors, work colleagues, incidental acquaintances, and strangers. And you can see that the figures range from 0.56 to 0.17. This set of figures, which is, as I say, from Connelly and Ones, is basically corrected up by assuming that you have an infinite number of other raters, which is a bit of a kind of strange thing to do. The main thing that you can see from this is that intimates ratings tend to converge fairly well with self-ratings, intimates being family, friends, and cohabitors, whereas work colleagues, incidental acquaintances, and strangers, even if you get the very best possible measurement, don't converge terribly well. But if we move on, there's a big surprise. I mean, another question that you might ask is which sort of ratings actually predict subsequent behavior? And the answer seems to be that self-ratings, if you look at job performance, actually rather poorly predict behavior, whereas other ratings predict it actually rather well. I mean, we've got single correlations here of 0.55, 0.45. There's relatively little correlation between the different components of personality. So that suggests multiple R's, which would be very considerable. So you've got this rather strange situation where, if you like, people that are pretty poor raters, i.e. colleagues at work, actually predict behavior better than much better raters of personality. Well, how does one summarize all of this data? Well, first of all, no single rating is valid or reliable. And I think this probably applies to self-ratings, if it were possible to measure it. Different sources of ratings are not interchangeable. A large number of raters is required for valid measurement. I also think, looking at this, the only way that I can explain why work colleagues are so successful is that personality must be context-specific. And there's a great deal of other evidence for that. And finally, predictive validity is highest for context-specific ratings. I'm coming to an end, aren't I? I don't think I'm going to be able to complete everything that I plan to talk about, but people think that you can deal with the problems of self-report is to use what are called MTMM designs. The notion of this is that any single method will provide you biased measures, bias by artifacts, method bias, and so on, whereas correlations across methods will capture true variance. So if you use, if you like, cross-method correlation matrices, you'll recover true effects. This is a standard MTMM design. These are personality variables. That's emotional stability, agreeableness, conscientiousness. Those are self-raters. That's one other rater, and that's a second other rater. And you can see that this factor supposedly underpins each of the different ratings of emotional stability, this, each of the different ratings of agreeableness, this, each of the different ratings of conscientiousness, and these are method factors. And the idea of this approach, as I say, is that it's going to uncover pure measures of the underlying personality variable. I don't actually think that these MTMM models do what they claim to do. I suppose the first thing I should say is that there are many, many different multi-tray, multi-method designs. But certainly the one that we looked at assumes that different ratings are interchangeable. Well, I've just shown you from the Connelly and Ones data that that is simply not true. Now, there are models that can handle that, but I think that there is a fundamentally more important problem, and that is that MTMM models assume what's called a common factor model, i.e. that the ratings are a function of some underlying variable. So each rating, if you like, is effectively a parallel measure of emotional stability in that particular example. I think on the data of Connelly and Ones, that can't be true. I don't think, for example, that different work colleagues are supplying the same information. Rather, it's the other way round. They're supplying valid but different information, which when you accumulate it, gives you valid measurement. That's what's called a causal indicator model. And I think, basically, if that is true, certainly there is no current MTMM model which will recover true ratings. And I'm even doubtful about whether any such model could be constructed, even you know, if you take account of the correctness of causal indicators. So I think probably the best possible solution is to use the average of multiple ratings.